Section 18 of Institutes of the Christian Religion, Book 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M. White. Institutes of the Christian Religion, Book 1, by John Calvin. Translated by Henry Beveridge. Chapter 11, Part 2, 8. In regard to the origin of idols, the statement contained in the Book of Wisdom has been received with almost universal consent. That is to say, that they originated with those who bestowed this honor on the dead, from a superstitious regard to their memory. I admit that this perverse practice is of very high antiquity, and I deny not that it has a kind of torch by which the infatuated proneness of mankind to idolatry was kindled into a greater blaze. I do not, however, admit that it was the first origin of the practice. That idols were in use before the prevalence of that ambitious consecration of the images of the dead, frequently adverted to by profane writers, is evident from the words of Moses in Genesis 31:19. When he relates that Rachel stole her father's images, he speaks of the use of idols as a common vice. Hence we may infer that the human mind is, so to speak, a perpetual forge of idols. There was a kind of renewal of the world at the deluge, but before many years elapse, men are forging gods at will. There is reason to believe that in the Holy Patriarch's lifetime his grandchildren were given to idolatry, so that he must with his own eyes, not without the deepest grief, have seen the earth polluted with idols. That earth whose iniquities God had lately purged with so fearful a judgment. For Joshua testifies in Joshua 24:2 that Torah and Nahor, even before the birth of Abraham, were the worshippers of false gods. The progeny of Shem having so speedily revolted, what are we to think of the posterity of Ham, who had been cursed long before in their father? Thus, indeed, it is. The human mind, stuffed as it is with presumptuous rashness, dares to imagine a God suited to its own capacity, as it labors under dullness. Nay, is sunk in the grossest ignorance. It substitutes vanity and an empty phantom in the place of God. To those evils another is added. The God whom man has thus conceived inwardly he attempts to embody outwardly. The mind, in this way, conceives the idol, and the hand gives it birth. That idolatry has its origin in the idea which men have, that God is not present with us unless his presence is carnally exhibited, appears from the examples of the Israelites. Up, said they, make us gods which shall be before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. Exodus 22:1. They knew, indeed, that there was a God whose mighty power they had experienced in so many miracles, but they had no confidence of his being near to them, if they did not with their eyes behold a corporeal symbol of his presence, as an attestation to his actual government. They desired, therefore, to be assured by the image which went before them, that they were journeying under divine guidance, and daily experience shows that the flesh is always restless until it has obtained some figment like itself, with which it may vainly solace itself as a representation of God. In consequence of this blind passion, men have, almost in all ages since the world began, set up signs on which they imagined that God was visibly depicted to their eyes. 9. After such a figment is formed, adoration forthwith ensues. For when once men imagined that they beheld God in images, they also worshipped him as being there. At length, their eyes and mind becoming wholly engrossed by them, they began to grow more and more brutish, gazing and wondering as if some divinity were actually before them. It hence appears that men do not fall away to the worship of images until they have imbibed some idea of a grosser description. Not that they actually believe them to be gods, but that the power of divinity somehow or other resides in them. Therefore, whether it be God or a creature that is imaged, the moment you fall prostrate before it in veneration, you are so far fascinated by superstition. For this reason, the Lord not only forbade the erection of statues to himself, but also the consecration of titles and stones which might be set up for adoration. For the same reason, also, the the second commandment has an additional part concerning adoration. For as soon as a visible form is given to God, his power also is supposed to be annexed to it. So stupid are men that whenever they figure God, there they fix him, and by necessary consequence proceed to adore him. It makes no difference whether they worship the idol simply, or God in the idol. It is always idolatry when divine honors are paid to an idol, be the color what it may. And because God wills not to be worshipped superstitiously, whatever is bestowed upon idols is so much robbed from him. Let those attend to this who set about hunting for miserable pretexts in defense of the execrable idolatry in which for many past ages true religion has been buried and sunk. It is said that the images are not accounted gods, nor were the Jews so utterly thoughtless as not to remember that there was a God whose hand led them out of Egypt before they made the calf. Indeed, Aaron saying that these were the gods which had brought them out of Egypt, they intimated, in no ambiguous terms, that they wished to retain God, their deliverer, provided they saw him going before them in the calf. Nor are the heathen to be deemed to have been so stupid as not to understand that God was something else than wood and stone, for they changed the images at pleasure, but always retained the same gods in their minds. Besides, they daily consecrated new images without thinking they were making new gods. Read the excuses which Augustine tells us were employed by the idolaters of his time. The vulgar, when accused, replied that they did not worship the visible object, but the deity which dwelt in it invisibly. Those, again, who had what he calls a more refined religion, said that they neither worshipped the image nor any inhabiting deity, but by means of the corporeal image beheld a symbol of that which it was their duty to worship. What then? All idolaters, whether Jewish or Gentile, were actuated in the very way which has been described. Not contented with spiritual understanding, they thought that images would give them a surer and nearer impression. When once this preposterous representation of God was adopted, there was no limit until, diluted every now and then by new impostures, they came to think that God exerted his power in images. Still, the Jews were persuaded that under such images they worshipped the eternal God, the one true Lord of heaven and earth, and the Gentiles also, in worshipping their own false gods, supposed them to dwell in heaven. 10. It is an impudent falsehood to deny that the thing which was thus anciently done is also done in our day. For why do men prostrate themselves before images? Why, when in the act of praying, do they turn towards them as to the ears of God? It is indeed true, as Augustine says, in Psalm 113, that no person thus prays or worships, looking at an image, without being impressed with the idea that he is heard by it, or without hoping that what he wishes will be performed by it. Why are such distinctions made between different images of the same God, that while one is passed by, or receives only common honor, another is worshipped with the highest solemnities? Why do they fatigue themselves with votive pilgrimages to images, while they have many similar ones at home? Why at the present time do they fight for them to blood and slaughter, as for their altars and hearths, showing more willingness to part with the one God than with their idols? And yet I am not now detailing the gross errors of the vulgar, errors almost infinite in number, and in possession of almost all hearts. I am only referring to what those profess who are most desirous to clear themselves of idolatry. They say, we do not call them our gods, nor did either the Jews or Gentiles of old so call them. And yet the prophets never ceased to charge them with their idolatries with wood and stone for the very acts which are daily done by those who would be deemed Christians, namely, for worshipping God carnally in wood and stone. 11. I am not ignorant, however, and I have no wish to disguise the fact, that they endeavor to evade the charge by means of a more subtle distinction, which shall afterwards be fully considered. The worship which they pay to their images they cloak with the name idolatria, and deny to be idolatria. So they speak, holding that the worship which they call doulia may, without insult to God, be paid to statues and pictures. Hence, they think themselves blameless if they are only the servants and not the worshippers of idols. As if it were not a lighter matter to worship than to serve. And yet, while they take refuge in a Greek term, they very childishly contradict themselves. For the Greek word latruein, having no other meaning than to worship, what they say is just the same as if they were to confess that they worship their images without worshipping them. They cannot object that I am quibbling upon words. The fact is that they only betray their ignorance while they attempt to throw dust in the eyes of the simple. But how eloquent soever they may be, they will never prove by their eloquence that one and the same thing makes two. Let them show how the things differ if they would be thought different from ancient idolaters. For as a murderer or an adulterer will not escape conviction by giving some adventitious name to his crime, so it is absurd for them to expect that the subtle device of a name will exculpate them, if they, in fact, differ in nothing from idolaters whom they themselves are forced to condemn. But so far are they from proving that their case is different, that the source of the whole evil consists in a preposterous rivalship with them, while they with their minds devise, and with their hands execute, symbolical shapes of God. 12. I am not, however, so superstitious as to think that all visible representations of every kind are unlawful. But as sculpture and painting are gifts of God, what I insist for is that both shall be used purely and lawfully, that gifts which the Lord has bestowed upon us for his glory and our good shall not be preposterously abused, nay, shall not be perverted to our destruction. We think it unlawful to give a visible shape to God, because God himself has forbidden it, and because it cannot be done without, in some degree, tarnishing his glory. And lest any should think that we are singular in this opinion, those acquainted with the productions of sound divines will find that they have always disapproved of it. If it be unlawful to make any corporeal representation of God, still more unlawful must it be to worship such a representation instead of God, or to worship God in it. The only things, therefore, which ought to be painted or sculptured are things which can be presented to the eye. The majesty of God, which is far beyond the reach of any eye, must not be dishonored by unbecoming representations. Visible representations are of two classes, that is to say, historical, which give a representation of events, and pictorial, which merely exhibit bodily shapes and figures. The former are of some use for instruction or admonition. The later, so far as I can see, are only fitted for amusement. And yet it is certain that the later are almost the only kind which have hitherto been exhibited in churches. Hence we may infer that the exhibition was not the result of judicious selection, but of a foolish and inconsiderate longing. I say nothing as to the improper and unbecoming form in which they are presented, or the wanton license in which sculptors and painters have here indulged, a point to which I alluded a little ago, section 7. I only say that though they were otherwise faultless, they could not be of any utility in teaching. 13. But without reference to the above distinction, let us here consider whether it is expedient that churches should contain representations of any kind, whether of events or human forms. First, then, if we attach any weight to the authority of the ancient church, let us remember that for 500 years, during which religion was in a more prosperous condition, and a purer doctrine flourished, Christian churches were completely free from visible representations. Hence their first admission as an ornament to churches took place after the purity of the ministry had somewhat degenerated. I will not dispute as to the rationality of the grounds on which the first introduction of them proceeded, but if you compare the two periods, you will find that the latter had greatly declined from the purity of the times when images were unknown. What then? Are we to suppose that these holy fathers, if they had judged the thing to be useful and salutary, would have allowed the church to be so long without it? Undoubtedly, because they saw very little or no advantage, and the greatest danger in it, they rather rejected it intentionally, and on rational grounds, then omitted it through ignorance or carelessness. This is clearly attested by Augustine in these words: "When images are thus placed aloft in seats of honor, to be beheld by those who are praying or sacrificing, though they have neither sense nor life, yet from appearing as if they had both, they affect weak minds, just as if they lived and breathed." And again, in another passage, in Psalm 112, he says, "The effect produced, and in a manner extorted, by the bodily shape is, that the mind, being itself in a body, imagined that a body, which is so like its own, must be similarly affected." A little farther on he says, "Images are more capable of giving a wrong bent to an unhappy soul, from having mouth, eyes, ears, and feet, than of correcting it, as they neither speak, nor see, nor hear, nor walk." This undoubtedly is the reason why John, in 1 John 5:21, enjoins us to beware not only of the worship of idols, but also of idols themselves. And from the fearful infatuation under which the world has hitherto labored, almost to the entire destruction of piety, we know too well from experience that the moment images appear in churches, idolatry has as it were raised its banner, because the folly of manhood cannot moderate itself, but forthwith falls away to superstitious worship. Even were the danger less imminent, still, when I consider the proper end for which churches are erected, it appears to me more unbecoming their sacredness than I well can tell, to admit any other images than those living symbols which the Lord has consecrated by his own word. I mean baptism and the Lord's Supper, with the other ceremonies. By these our eyes ought to be more steadily fixed and more vividly impressed than to require the aid of any images which the wit of man may devise. Such, then, is the uncomparable blessings of images, a blessing, the want of which, if we believe the papists, cannot possibly be compensated. 14. Enough, I believe, would have been said on this subject, were I not in a manner arrested by the Council of Nice. Not the celebrated council which Constantine the Great assembled, but one which was held 800 years ago by the orders and under the auspices of the Empress Irene. This council decreed not only that images were to be used in churches, but also that they were to be worshipped. Everything, therefore, that I have said is in danger of suffering great prejudice from the authority of this synod. To confess the truth, however, I am not so much moved by this consideration as by a wish to make my readers aware of the lengths to which the infatuation has been carried by those who had a greater fondness for images than became Christians. But let us first dispose of this matter. Those who defend the use of images appeal to that synod for support. But there is a refutation extant which bears the name of Charlemagne, and which is proved by its style to be a production of that period. It gives the opinions delivered by the bishops who were present, and the arguments by which they supported them. John, deputy of the Eastern churches, said, "God created man in his own image," and thence inferred that images ought to be used. He also thought there was a recommendation of images in the following passage: "Show me thy face, for it is beautiful." Another, in order to prove that images ought to be placed on altars, quoted the passage, "No man, when he has lighted a candle, putteth it under a bushel." Another, to show the utility of looking at images, quoted a verse of the Psalms: "The light of thy countenance, O Lord, has shone upon us." Another laid hold of this similitude: "As the patriarchs used the sacrifices of the Gentiles, so ought Christians to use the images of saints instead of the idols of the Gentiles." They also twisted to the same effect the words, "Lord, I have loved the beauty of thy house." But the most ingenious interpretation was the following: "As we have heard, so also have we seen." Therefore, God is known not merely by the hearing of the word, but also by the seeing of images. Bishop Theodore was equally acute. God, says he, is to be admired in his saints, and it is elsewhere said, "to the saints who are on earth." Therefore, this must refer to images. In short, their absurdities are so extreme that it is painful even to quote them. 15. When they treat of adoration, great stress is laid on the worship of Pharaoh. the staff of Joseph, and the inscription which Jacob set up. In this last case, they not only pervert the meaning of Scripture, but quote what is nowhere to be found. Then the passages, "Worship at his footstool," "Worship in his holy mountain," "The rulers of the people will worship before thy face," seem to them very solid and opposite proofs. Were one, with the view of turning the defenders of images into ridicule, to put words into their mouths, could they be made to utter greater and grosser absurdities? But to put an end to all doubt on the subject of images, Theodosius, bishop of Myra, confirms the propriety of worshipping them by the dreams of his archdeacon, which he adduces with as much gravity as if he were in possession of a response from heaven. Let the patrons of images now go and urge us with the decree of this synod, as if the venerable fathers did not bring themselves into utter discredit by handling Scripture so childishly, or wresting it so shamefully and profanely. 16. I come now to monstrous impieties, which it is strange they ventured to utter, and twice strange that all men did not protest against with the utmost detestation. It is right to expose this frantic and flagitious extravagance, and thereby deprive the worship of images of that gloss of antiquity in which papists seek to deck it. Theodosius, bishop of Amora, fires oft an anathema at all who object to the worship of images. Another attributes all the calamities of Greece and the East to the crime of not having worshipped them. Of what punishment then are the prophets, apostles, and martyrs worthy, in whose day no images existed? They afterwards add that if the statue of the emperor is met with odors and incense, much more are the images of saints entitled to the honor. Constantius, bishop of Constantia in Cyprus, professes to embrace images with reverence, and declares that he will pay them the respect which is due to the ever-blessed Trinity. Every person refusing to do the same thing he anathematizes and classes with Marcionites and Manichees. Lest you should think this the private opinion of an individual, they all assent. Nay, John the Eastern Legate, carried still farther by his zeal, declares it would be better to allow a city to be filled with brothels than be denied the worship of images. At last it is resolved with one consent that the Samaritans are the worst of all heretics, and that the enemies of images are worse than the Samaritans. But that the play may not pass off without the accustomed plaudite, the whole thus concludes: Rejoice and exult, ye who, having the image of Christ, offer sacrifice to it. Where is now the distinction of latria and dulia, with which they would throw dust in all eyes, human and divine? The council unreservedly relies as much on images as on the living God. End of section 18. Recording by M. White.